evening, everyone. Tonight we are going to have kind of two different topics that aren't really connected, but they are connected to Shavuot that's coming up. One is just kind of a very brief look at the Brit Khorav. I felt like the Treaty at Horev, I felt like I really had to at least look at it, just briefly and talk about certain elements that kind of mirror the treaty process in the ancient Near East, particularly because this is something whenever I would have students who would be like, start talking about biblical criticism, and I'm like, don't argue with a biblical critic, it's not a good idea. And they'd be like, well, why isn't it a good idea? I said, well, for two reasons. The basic reason is that biblical criticism is starting with an assumption that you cannot work against. Okay, your assumption as religious Jews who believe the Torah is given to Moshe Sinai, your assumption is that God interferes in the world as it is. There could be a miracle, and you can have direct revelation, and God can interfere in history and in the world. The assumption of science, so the way science works is they say, let us assume that everything, the way things work now is the way things always worked. You don't have miracles with God coming in, because if you do, then when you say why dinosaurs, the answer is, well, God. Well, that you can't do science that way, right? So science, the assumption, and that expands to the general academic process, where the academic process assumes that God's not coming in and switching stuff around. So the assumption is the things that you have come from humans. That is the basic assumption, and that is the assumption they're starting with. And the rules of that game are rules by which you are going to lose, right? If your answer is, but God, then you are losing according to the rules of, well, no, you can't say that, right? That's the first reason that I told them not to argue with a biblical critic. And I said the other reason is that texts that are very central in biblical criticism are texts that you do not remember. And they are going to mention the Treaty of Khorav and talk about sprinkling the blood on the nation. And you're going to say, what? And they're going to be like, you don't even know that, right? And you're going to feel like an idiot. And then you kind of lost, right? So don't do it. That's what I would say. Don't do it. It's not going to be productive. So I did want to at least address it briefly, because it's something that we don't talk a lot about when we talk about the giving of the Torah at Sinai. Okay, so I'm just going to share. So let's do I'll share my screen because I know you guys like that, and we will look in the text. Here we are. Okay, so what is the Brit Khorav? All right. So here we have. So let's start from the beginning. Okay, first Moshe says we're going to go up to God, who, this God says to Moshe, rather, says, go up to God, you and Aharon and Nadav and Avihu and 70 of the elders, okay? And you should bow down from afar, right? And Moshe himself is the one who's going to go up. They're not going to actually approach God, and the nation is not going to go up with him, okay? And Moshe came and he spoke all these words and the laws to the nation. And this is where we almost have Nasev Nishma, right? We almost have, we will do when we will hear, almost. It says, Vayomru kol dvarim asher diber Hashem naseh, and they said, all the words that God has spoken, we will do, right? And Moshe wrote the words of the Lord, and he gets up in the morning and he builds an altar, right? And this is the English, right? I'm just following in the Hebrew. And he builds 12 pillars for the 12 tribes, right? And it's important that the 12 tribes are going to be represented in these pillars, as we will understand in a bit. And he sent to the young men of Israel, and they brought sacrifices. And then Moshe takes half the blood and he puts it in basins, and half the blood he throws on the altar, right? And he took the book of the Sefer Habrit, right? The book of the treaty, the thing on which the treaty is written. Vayikra ba'oznei ha'am. He called it, he read it out in the hearing of the people. Vayomru, and here we have in the real Nasev, Vayomru, kol asher diber Hashem nasev v'nishma. Said everything that God has spoken, we will do and we will hear. We will hear meaning we will obey, right? Vayikach Moshe et hadam vayizrok al ha'am. Right, so he took half blood, put it on the altar, and half of the blood he throws on the people. Vayomer hine dam habrit. Asher karat Hashem imachem al kol hadvarim ha'ela. This is the blood of the covenant, right, that God is making with you, right? So half on the altar, one assumes for God, and half on the people, and now we have a covenant. And what is the next thing that's going to happen? What happens when you make a treaty? You get together and you make a treaty, okay? And we're going to have something special here because they're going to see God, quote unquote, right? Moshe and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, the 70 elders, they see God, and they see the work of a sapphire stone, or maybe a lapis lazuli. I never know how to pronounce that correctly. Lapis lazuli, and it's under God, right? So what does it mean that they saw the God of Israel? Note that it doesn't use the tetragrammaton there. It doesn't say Yud Kei Vav Kei. So they saw the God of Israel, and under his feet, as if it was this gemstone, right? This pure gemstone. It's possible that the reason it's talking about that is that you shouldn't really think that they saw it. What did they saw? See, they saw kind of like underneath God, as it were. Possibly. It's not clear. But that's the way I would like to interpret it, honestly. And on the nobles of the children of Israel, God didn't send his hand. Why would we think that? Because what's the typical thing that happens? What is a general belief? We know from Manoach, right? From the father of Shimshon, when you see God, what happens? You die, right? There's a general idea that you can't see God and live, right? Seeing God means you're going to die. You can't see, it's just not going to happen. But in this case, they survive, right? And by Yechazu et Elohim, or at Elohim, they saw God, by Yochlu, by Yishtu, and they ate and they drank. Now, of course, in the exegetes and the midrashim, how could this shows how they were unworthy, that they could get divine revelation and then eat and drink. In the context, what's happening is part of the covenant, right? Like a king, like two kings sitting together, and they're now making a treaty, or messengers of one king, and the king, they sit down and now they eat to make it official, right? They're eating and they're drinking. We have made a treaty. We're now, and now we can eat and drink. Okay, it's part of the process. And now Moshe goes up to receive the actual Torah. Okay, and here, of course, there's a difference. So Moshe goes up, and he says to the elders, "You stay here, right? Aaron and Hor staying here, okay." And while I'm gone, anyone who has a cause, go to Aaron and Hor, they'll take care of it. And then Moshe goes up and he's covered by a cloud. So that is different, right? So you had a standard covenant, right? We all agree, we're all agreeing to this thing. It was read out, everyone heard it. They agreed it, sprinkled blood on the altar, sprinkled blood on the people. Now we're all part of the same covenant. The leaders sat and ate and drank. Now there's a covenant, okay? Then what happens when Moshe comes out and they have broken the covenant? He breaks the tablet, right? He breaks the tablet. And that breaking the tablet is literally breaking the covenant. In other words, that we take it as, oh, Moshe was so super angry, he had to break something. No, that's actually an action. That is actually saying this covenant is null and void, right? This covenant is now null and void. And we see this actually. We've seen like broken contracts, right? In certain ancient Near Eastern things where they seem to have been deliberately broken, right? That is, it is saying this is null and void. When Moshe sees that they are now worshiping the calf, he breaks it. This covenant is null and void, and in fact, he needs to get a new set of luchot, a new set of tablets, right? Because not just because he broke them, because that covenant's gone, right? That covenant's gone. On other occasions, I've talked about how the whole relationship between God and Israel changes because of what follows from the golden calf, which is the need, on the one hand, Moshe's insistence that God and essentially the Bnei Israel, the Israelites' insistence that God continue among the people, at the same time as the idea that if you sin, you die, right? And then we get to a new stage of that relationship where we have what we call the Shlosh Esrei Midot, the 13 attributes of God, but which go on actually for more than 13, with the idea that God is a patient God, and he stretches the punishment out over generations. And what that means is there's no genocide of a generation, as it were, because of a sin, right? If they sin, it's stretched out over generations so that they will be able to survive with God among them. In other words, this solves that conflict between we want God with us, but we're going to sin because that's the way we are, right? So if you have God with you and you sin, you're not going to die. God's going to split the punishment. Remember that, and I one of my big things is like sin and how people see sin and the kind of nature of sin, that in general, when we get to up until the end of the first temple period, there's a pretty basic idea that sin has got to be paid for. Sin is almost a physical thing. Sin is like, it's like if you break a pot, you can't just put it back together like new, it's broken. So now what are you going to do, right? When you sin, you do damage, that damage must be fixed, right? And the fix is the punishment. So the punishment has to happen. So does it happen all at once, or does it get stretched? And the answer is it gets stretched so that people can survive, right? Then once we get, and I've said this before, but still it bears repeating, once we get to Yechezkel, once we get to the end of the first temple period, Yechezkel, and to a certain extent Yirmiyahu, there's this idea that no, punishment doesn't pass over generations, doesn't continue through generations, because that's not fair, right? That's not fair. But that's because people's mindset has changed in terms of the way they see sin, and frankly, in the terms of the way they see fairness also. In terms of what is the bigger problem now? Is the bigger problem the idea that we sinned horribly, who's going to pay? Or is the bigger problem, it isn't fair that I'm paying for my father's sin, right? So depending on which, so that becomes the bigger problem when we get to the first temple period. It becomes the bigger theological and philosophical problem. So anyway, so I wanted to kind of go over that and talk a little bit about the Brit B'Chorev, the Treaty at Horev, because it is kind of a central occasion that we never talk about. I'm sure that some of you guys have heard it talked about, but I will tell you that in middle school and in high school, if you had told me when Moshe sprinkled half the blood on the altar and half the blood on the people, I would be like, what Torah did you read? Because I didn't learn that part, right? Because I wouldn't have remembered that part. I remember Moshe going up and getting tablets and coming down, sprinkling blood on people. I didn't remember that, right? And even the part with them seeing the gemstone and eating was kind of, you did it kind of quickly, and you read some Midrash about it. It's not right because the whole scene is very, very difficult to kind of swallow. And so I thought it was at least important to kind of address that big piece of that whole scenario of getting the Torah, right? And now the next part that I wanted to discuss is canonization. I'm going to pause for questions. Yes, go ahead.
Just a comment. I'm going. This rabbi sent me this program. It's from I forget the rabbi's name, in the Gush. He's one of the yeshivas in the Gush. It's about the idea about biblical criticism from an Orthodox viewpoint.
Yes, the Gush is where to go for that. Yeah.
Yeah, and he really goes into detail how there's all sorts of rabbinic commentaries. It's not so simple that God dictated every word and that it happened.
Okay, we're gonna go there. Okay, fine.
And
all right, yes. Okay, go ahead.
Sewed different parchments together, and this is from Midrash and from the Talmud. So this would, there seem to have been different covenants. So it's not the idea. Like I remember one teacher telling us basically that God gave the Torah on Sinai. In other words, everything that happened to the end of Moshe's life on Sinai, everything that happened in Midbar, and Moshe, like he implied that it was all written down and it wasn't revealed to all the people, but it's not that simple.
Right. Okay. So that was an excellent point. An excellent, the difference between an excellent point and a good point. A good question is a question I have an answer for. An excellent question brings me to my next point. So that was an excellent question. So, what is the? Let's talk about the different aspects of canonization. Okay. When we talk about canonization, it's never clear just from the word what we're going to talk about. Okay, so what could we be talking about? One of the things was every word given to Moses at Sinai? Okay, and also did people believe that every word was given to Moses from Sinai? Those are two different questions, right? At what point is that belief very clear in Jewish tradition? All right, so I can say, so let's start with the Jewish traditional approach to was every word given. So right, we have things like it's saying in Ibn Ezra, and we have things in the Talmud where it's saying, well, who wrote the last 10 psukim, right? And Ibn Ezra extends that to verses like Vaknani az ba'aretz, and the Canaanites were then in the land, right? Where it seems to be that it's written from a perspective when they're not in the land, right? Which would be afterwards. So Ibn Ezra certainly seems to also be hinting to this idea that there were certain verses that were not written by Moshe. That weren't written by Moshe. And he points out those verses. However, he points out those verses, okay? To say that Ibn Ezra, and some people do take it that far, it's not fair to Ibn Ezra, right? It's not fair to Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra would never have agreed with biblical criticism. We have to say it. Ibn Ezra was very specific about which verses he thought fell out of that thing of was every verse written by Moshe. Okay, so he has the last verses after Moshe's death, right, which the Gemara talks about, which the Talmud talks about. They say who wrote those last verses, right? And there's an argument about it. By the way, that argument about it gives rise to one of my favorite quotes from David Zvi Hoffman. David Zvi Hoffman was the German commentator who actually took a somewhat scientific approach to a lot of things, and he one of the answers to who wrote the last verses after Moshe dies, and they said every verse God said and Moshe wrote it and repeated it, and God, and these verses God said it and Moshe wrote it bidema, and they're the standard we always say with tears, right? By the way, more people think that it means silently. In other words, those he couldn't repeat because it wasn't like appropriate, right? So the other ones he repeated because he didn't see it, right? And so the other ones, and then other ones he just wrote, or he wrote them with tears. And David Zvi Hoffman said, "How could he write them with tears? That's not halachically permissible. You can't write a Torah with tears. How does that work?" And I'm like, "You're such a yucky." Only a yucky would be like, well, he's clearly not. Who cries? No one cries ever, right? He's writing it with tears. And actually, his idea is that it was actually kind of a reappearing ink. Remember this disappearing, reappearing ink? It's like this reappearing ink that Moshe wrote it in something that would only appear after he died. He wrote this special thing. And I think he actually did, if I remember correctly, he actually did like experiments to find like these inks, they have these inks that you could do that with. But that was his idea. But that's one of the explanations in the Talmud of what happened. And Moshe, even those verses Moshe wrote, right? Of course, there is an opinion that Yoshua wrote them, and then Ibn Ezra points to that and says, "Hey, there are other verses that weren't necessarily written by Moshe." However, he did not think that this was true of huge swaths of the Torah, right? At the same time, if we read the Torah, and let's go into this. This is first. I'll tell a little anecdote. When I was teaching at NYU, I was TAing at NYU, and there was a course on, it was like Introduction to Western Literature, and we started with translation of, everything was in English translation. We started with parts of the Bible, and then we moved on to Greek stuff, etc. And the person who was teaching it, Bob Chazen, who is amazing. He's a medievalist and quite famous, but a caring teacher who could run a discussion in a lecture hall of 150 students. It was amazing. It was great to see. And he wouldn't call the Pentateuch because that would just scare everyone and confuse them. He called it the books of Moses. He called it the books of Moses so it would be more understandable. And a student came up to me. He was Asian, so I assume he wasn't from a Jewish or Christian tradition. And he said to me, I read through the book. Where does it say that the whole book was for Moses? Where does it say that? He was like, I missed it, right? Where does it say that Moses wrote the whole book? Right? And of course it doesn't. The book of, if you read the Torah, nowhere does it say, and Moshe wrote this entire book. There are places where he gets some laws. There are places where he writes some stuff, right? Nowhere does it say he wrote the whole book. Nowhere does it say that what God is even giving him at Sinai, it includes Breshit, includes Genesis. Certainly not that. Like it's not. It, you know, of course, there's the Rashi's explanation. Why does the Torah even include Genesis? Why does it even include Breshit? Right? But the idea clearly is that he's being given laws, right? So where in the world does it say that? And the answer is, well, it doesn't. It doesn't. And in fact, places where it says the Torah, and I'm going to share my screen for a second because I have this ready. I see there's another question. I'll get to it in just a second. So here, I believe this, yes. So here's an example of a place where it uses Torah and where in rabbinic law it's interpreted as applying to the entire Torah, where it seems in context to be talking about one specific part of Torah. So that is, here are the laws. What we're looking at here are the laws of the king, right? You come to the land, right? When you are, I'll just read from the English, when you will come to the land, you shall possess it, you shall dwell in it, and you'll just say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around about me. Okay, and now we have the laws of the king. He shouldn't multiply horses, right? He shouldn't, should not take too many wives, okay? And then says, and when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write a copy of this law in a book. V'chatav lo et mishneh haTorah hazot. Right? He should write a copy of this Torah. Right? Now here it's clear, what does he need to write in context? In context, in the pshat, as we would say, the plain meaning of the text, what he needs to write are the rules for the king. Right? He needs to really know these rules. He can't forget about these rules. So he's got to have a copy of the rules that he wrote near him. Now, how do we interpret it? What's the rabbinic interpretation? He has to write an entire Torah. And he's got to keep it on his person at all times, except when he goes like to the bathroom. Right? But he has to keep it, he has to write an entire Torah, and he has to have the Torah on him. Okay. So this is a classic case where we take the word Torah and we interpret it as being the whole Torah, where if we were reading the plain meaning of the text, it means these laws. And there are several places that are like that, where it says Torah, and we can easily interpret it as meaning those particular laws, as opposed to the entire book. However, and this is where we get to the next part, we say, well, how do we know if you just read the 5 books, it seems like, let's say the books of the law are set to Moshe, but not all given at Sinai, for example, right? And then you have the other books where you're like, okay, so it doesn't say that Moshe wrote them, but the fact is that, and I'm going to remind you, our earliest books, our earliest copies of the Torah pretty much are from Qumran, and thereabouts. Those are earliest copies of books of the Torah. The priestly blessing that's on that silver amulet, that predates the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that's just a few verses. If we talk about actual books, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Once we get to the Second Temple period, once we get to that period, there is an agreed upon belief that the 5 books of Moses were given to Moses, and he wrote them down. Okay, in other words, we don't have anything from before the belief that these 5 books came from Moses. Do you understand what I mean? Right? So it's hard I can say, well, gee, in the plain meaning of the text, it doesn't say that Moses wrote the 5 books, right? It doesn't, there's no verse that says, and he wrote from Breshit on through Devarim. It doesn't say that, right? However, from the earliest time that we have copies of the books, Jews believe that Moshe wrote the 5 books. That's what all Jews believe. Moshe wrote the 5 books, right? So we have Philo in Alexandria talking about how the Septuagint, and by Septuagint, he means, and I mean in this case, the Greek translation of those 5 books, how the Greek translation of those 5 books, which predates the Greek translation of the other books, the Greek translation of those 5 books, what you call the Old Greek, right? That it actually has the status of being given, of coming from Moshe, because of the miracle is talked about, that's written about in the letter of Aristeas, and that we're familiar with, that they were all the elders came up with the same translation, which means that it was a miracle and essentially divinely given, and exactly from Philo's point of view, exactly mirrors the divine nature of the Hebrew text. And he talks about the 5 books coming of Moses, and he'll say, and Moses said, and he'll quote a verse from Breshit, from Genesis, right? He sees it, it's very clear, they're all from Moshe, and everyone calls these books of Moshe. So let's look at an example. Oh, I'd like to see that there's a question. Here's a question. So what do I think is the reason why the covenantal aspects of Ma'amad HaChorev are downplayed in traditional Jewish education? Okay. Why do I think that we don't learn a lot about the Treaty of Khorav? I think for one thing, it's not talking about, it doesn't fit very well, or it doesn't fit comfortably with the narrative that Moshe goes up and receives the Torah, and that's it, and that's all that's going on. Because here there seems to be an explication of laws before Moshe goes up. And that goes before we say Na'aseh v'nishma. The Israelites say Na'aseh v'nishma, right? Before anyone says we will do and we will obey, it seems like they're hearing some laws, right? And where are those laws from? It's not clear. There's a covenant. Moshe hasn't gone up, right? And there's a covenant that they're agreeing to. So it doesn't fit very well into what we normally think of as the narrative. And then you have that very kind of, I mean, from a theological point of view, I find it somewhat distressing, this idea that they see God, right? And it says, and they saw him, and it says, and they saw him, and they were fine, and then they sat and ate. It's like, what the heck? I mean, it's not even Moshe, it's the elders. Who the heck are they? Okay, they're the elders, but still 70 of them, right? They're sitting down and eating. Right now, the Midrash will say, "Oh, and that was really inappropriate. That was wrong." And of course, there are all those. Once you come to the Midrash and exegesis, absolutely, we'll delve into these issues. But in terms of just thinking about the narrative, and again, did I learn these verses when I was young? I assume I learned it. Did I remember it? It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit nicely into the narrative of the way we think about it. And so it's much easier to kind of just like let it kind of drop out. You could ask differently, why was the narrative formed the way it was? And by the narrative, I don't mean the biblical narrative. I mean the narrative around the biblical narrative. Why was the narrative the way we think about it in terms of getting the Torah at Sinai and like that's it, as opposed to kind of integrating this part in better, if you know what I mean. That's harder to explain, but again, I think it's because very early on, this is a problematic thing. Very early on, it's kind of problematic to the whole seeing God thing, and it's very quick, very early. Again, as we saw, I think it was in the Mesha Stele that he talks about carrying away the vessels of the Israelite God, right? He doesn't talk about carrying away the God, right? They're not using idols for God. God is unseen, right? The Israelite God is unseen. So what's going on here? I think very early on, this was very, very problematic. So I wasn't expecting to delve into that aspect of it tonight. If it's super important, maybe I could do it some other time. But I think those are several of the reasons why it was downplayed in traditional Jewish education.
If I could just interject for a second,
Sure.
what you're saying sounds like a very logical explanation of why it would be downplayed. But on the other hand, like if you look at Rashi actually says straight out, he says that when Moshe read the Sefer HaBrit, he explains, what's the Sefer HaBrit? He says, Mi Bereshit va'ad matan Torah u'mitzvot shenitztavu b'mara. In other words, everything up till that point. And nothing after. He says that. He says it straight out.
Because Rashi's great. Yeah. So Rashi is great, and yeah, he says that. But Rashi's already talking. I think that you already again. I think that this narrative that focuses on getting everything at Sinai, where it is clearly not. Like you read the parsha, like so you know that we got other laws, right? But reconciling this, I just think that tradition predates Rashi. Like that way of looking at things predates Rashi, and so it's hard to kind of easily when I say traditional Jewish education, let's face it, when do we learn this? We learn it in middle school, right? And in middle school, even if you learn this, you're going to forget it because the main thing is Sinai, right? Just in terms of the way you think of what you talk about all the time is Sinai. You're not going to remember this weird thing that you really don't want to think about. Ew, blood, right? So I think that that's a big part of it, is that it just doesn't fit with this already, the way we kind of move, the kind of the whole story's been kind of formed in our minds. And obviously Rashi, who's looking at everything verse by verse, he's going to explain it also because he's amazing, but he's going to explain it. But if we just think about it in terms of the story, it's much easier to think about the story with all centered around Sinai, and without this, and it's harder to integrate the whole thing of Horev. And I think that predates Rashi. I think that goes way back. Okay, so I mean that's just I haven't done research on this. Maybe if we look at Midrash, we'll see that there's a lot. But I think especially the emphasis on the Aseret Dibrot, on the Ten Commandments, also makes it much easier to talk about Sinai and just kind of forget about this whole thing with a ritual. Okay, so going back to our canonization issue, so let's take a look actually at what some people, let's look at, okay, so we have the Torah, right? And then we have what we in Jewish tradition, we have what they call in academic English, the Tripartite Canon, which is the three-part canon, which is Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, right? Now, there's a real meaning to that, because Torah are the 5 books of Moses, right? Nevi'im are the prophets, and they are considered prophetic. They are considered actually prophetic. And then you have the Ketuvim, the writings, which are written in this kind of, they're divinely inspired, okay? The question is, how long does that tradition go back? And when we look at that tradition, it's not clear that we have it in the Second Temple period. I'm going to show you for a second, and this connects also to the idea of the Torah from Moshe. So let me share my screen for a second. I'm not going to get too bogged down on this one, but I would like to kind of just address it. Okay. So here we look. Here we can see. Oh, this is very small. Let's see if I can make it bigger. There we go. Okay. All right, so this is 4QMMT. This is Miksat Maseh Torah. This is a text that was discovered in Cave 4, and it explains from the point of view of the Dead Sea sect why they separated out. And they say, we have written that you must understand the book of Moses and the books of the prophets and of David and the annals of each generation. Now you see here, it looks like this entire thing has been let me put my little spotlight on. It looks like this whole thing has been reconstructed, and that's almost true. Okay, for a while, people really took it as, because they had like other little brackets inside, but frankly, a lot of this is reconstructed. So if we look in the Hebrew, okay, here we are. And you can see the Sefer Moshe is pretty clear in the book of Moses, and that's the Torah. And then the rest of it is pretty much not there. Again, they really have like a letter here, a letter there, but you don't really, it doesn't really, it looks like it may be, the prophets part really might be there. But it's the, what is, for a long time, people read it in a maximalist way and saw more of it more of it is being true than reconstructed. And they said, oh, here is evidence of the Torah and the Nevi'im, the books of the prophets, and then of David and the annals of each generation. That would be the Ketuvim, the writings, because that includes Tehillim, Psalms. And in fact, we do see the Psalms, the Tehillim are given much importance at Qumran. Here is another example of possibly of the Tripartite Canon, and you will see that I am now showing you. Let me see if I can connect. Yeah, I can go in here. This is actually part of an article from Jean Ulrich of Notre Dame, called the non-attestation of a tripartite canon, right? Because he argues with this idea, and he argues pretty effectively. This is the prologue of Ben Sira, which is also sometimes taken as proof of a tripartite canon. Okay, so here we have this is excerpts. This is where he refers to them. Okay, tu nomu kaiton propheton kaiton alonton kat autos ekoluthekoton. Okay, so that's the law, the prophets, and I think this is a better translation than the others that followed them. The other one is tu normal. Again, normal law, which is always going to be in general the Torah. Kaiton propheton is pretty much a translation of Torah, right? Kaiton propheton, obviously the prophets. Kaiton alon patron biblion, and books of the other ancestors, right? Honomos, right? Torah. Kai prophetai, and the prophecies. Kai ta loipa ton biblion, right? And the other books. Okay, so this sounds like, is this a tripartite canon or not? And it sounds like maybe it could be, or it could just be saying he knows that there are other books that don't fit into the Torah or the prophets, right? And then it's just wide open. Does this equal the Ketuvim or not? How closed is this canon? And that brings us to another issue in terms of what do we mean when we say canon and canonization. I'm going to stop screen sharing for a second. Can I just stop it here? Okay. So what do we mean when we say canonization? Yes, there are different levels of canonization. So we can mean, is the Torah considered from God? That's usually not what we mean by canonization, but for Jews, I think a lot of times it does come up a lot. The other one is there a list of books? Is there a static list of books? And that's it. That's what's in the canon. Okay. Now that is very much a lot of times and then the third possibility is, are these books considered holy? And finally, are these books considered unalterable? Okay, are these books considered unalterable? So what do I mean? A lot of times when a Jewish scholar, I shouldn't say a lot of times, sometimes when a Jewish scholar and a Christian scholar are arguing whether something is part of the canon or not, or whether something is considered part of the canon, okay, or whether there is a canon. Was there a canon in the Second Temple period? Sometimes it boils down to a different definition of canon, okay? Because a lot of times for Christians, canon means you have a list of books and you check them off. This is the list. Is there a list? And then it ends and anything that's out is out, right? Is that what there is in the Second Temple period? And no, it's not that close to canon, okay? Whereas a Jew, I think, I mean, maybe I'm just generalizing for me, right? Whereas I would say, is there a list of holy books that everyone agrees is part of a canon? And then there's some other books floating around, okay, that some people think is a canon, some people are part of the canon, and for some people are not, right? There are books that are clearly part of a Jewish canon in the Second Temple period. There are books you're going to find, if you find them at Qumran and also at Masada and also today in the Masoretic Judean, Masoretic Bible, you've got that's a pretty good, to my mind, you've got a pretty good case. Those books were part of the canon and referred to by, Philo and Ben Sira. We're talking about things that are part of the canon. Okay. So as an example, let's take a look. And I'll pause for just a second. There's a question from Susan. Do you think what was referred to as annals is possibly a reference to Divrei Hayamim? It could be, what he's referring to as annals could be Divrei Hayamim Chronicles, but it's more likely to be books like Kings, right? A book like Kings is not a prophetic book. It's also not part of the Torah. So if he's saying books of the Torah, the books of the prophets, and other books, annals, right? Like the Kings, we consider it part of Nevi'im, of the prophets. We do that because of what's considered the level of holiness, right? But it's not a book of prophecy, right? It's a book of history, right? With some prophecies in it. So we're so used to thinking of it as part of those books. Probably the references is more to books like Kings. That's Melachim, excuse me, Melachim. So that's my guess. Okay. So where was I? So let me share my screen once again. I think you guys are getting a sense of why I didn't give you handouts. I'm doing a lot of skipping around in this class. Okay, so here, what did I want to show you? Yes. Just a moment. I want to make sure. Yes. Okay, so this is what I mean in terms of books being part of the canon when you don't have a completely closed canon. Okay. Now here we have books of Treasar. Now this is particularly talking about places where they show up. The fact that you don't have Hosea and Amos here, for example, doesn't mean they weren't found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Famously, the Dead Sea Scrolls have pieces of every biblical book except Esther, right? Assuming that we put Ezra and Nehemiah together, right? If we have Ezra and Nehemiah are one book, then the Dead Sea Scrolls have fragments of every single biblical book except for Esther. But what it means is these were found in a single. These were found in a single scroll. I just like to remind you why we have Treasar, the Minor Prophets, are all in one book. Why are they in one book? The Talmud tells us because they were too short to be in separate books. They're so short, if you put them in separate books, they would be lost. We should say separate scrolls, right? If they were in separate scrolls, they're so short that they would be lost. And in fact, we see them being written together in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We see them being written together in Nachal Chever, okay? And then we see them also in the Septuagint, of course, right? In Septuagint, we have all of them naturally. And in Tanakh, and their order is actually quite similar in Tanakh and Septuagint, kind of different in Nachal Chever. And in Dead Sea Scrolls, it's very interesting because it's very clear that they have the end of the prophets of Shivat Yonah, the return to Zion, and then Yonah, they kind of don't know what to do with, and they put him at the end. It's a very unusual book of Treasar, Yonah, because it's not a book of prophecies. It's a story. So here we see that in not only are they keeping these books, they are also keeping the tradition of writing them in a single scroll. Okay. Now, at the same time, different communities are keeping different books. So, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, besides all the books of Tanakh, they are keeping Jubilees. They are keeping Enochs. They are keeping other books that don't make it into any sort of canon that we have. Other canon of Judaism that we have. I shouldn't say any. What are the canons that we have from Judaism? That we have in their entirety. We have, of course, the Masoretic text, what we could call the standard Judean canon from the destruction, right, from the end of the Second Temple period, right, which are the books that the kind of standardized Jewish community that survived the destruction decided these are the books that are holy. These are the books we're keeping. These are the books we're copying over. And even though if other books are important, like let's say Ben Sira, they are not holy enough to be part of this, okay? Then we have a canon like the Septuagint, right? The Greek Bible, which was used then by the Christian community. And that has other books like they kept Ben Sira, of course. They kept Susanna and the Dragon. They kept Belle and the Dragon, rather. There's Belle and the Dragon, right? Belle and the Dragon, Susanna. They kept Judith, but books that we know of, also Judith, they kept First and Second Maccabees. There were books there that were Tobit. There are books there that are, in general, if it was a book that didn't create theological problems and which had a good message, and hey, sometimes angels and demons, also cool, miracles, nice, right? If it was important, it could make it into the Septuagint. They didn't care if it was not originally written in Hebrew or even Aramaic. They didn't care if it was clearly written after the return to Zion. They didn't care if it didn't seem to be necessarily divinely inspired, or you'd have to kind of push it to see that it was divinely inspired, right? It's important. So First and Second Maccabees are both very important books, and they keep them, right? So that's a much wider canon. All right. So you have, so if you talk about was there a canon, so sometimes Christians will say, no, there wasn't, because you had these other books that for some Jews were part of a canon and some Jews were not. But at the same time, I would say there was a canon because there were still books that pretty much everyone considered part of the canon, right? So the books of Trias are the minor prophets. Like, for example, and here I'm going to go to Chazal, to the Gemara, to the Talmud for a second. Here we are. This I don't have a translation of. Let me just find the place if I can. Dear. Yeah, this is a cute one, actually. Hold on just a second. Let me find it. Here we are. Okay, so I'm going to translate this one. Rav Yehuda said, Baram, remember him, this man, for good. And Hananiah ben Chizkiah was his name. Without him, Sefer Yechezkel would have been hidden, would have been put away. Okay, they wouldn't have gotten into the canon, right? Wouldn't have gotten into Tanakh, into the canon that continued. Shayut v'Rav Sotrin divrei Torah, because his words went against the words of Torah. What went against the words of Torah? What he said about in the future in terms of sacrifices, the way sacrifices would be given, the way Kohanim were going to work, different things like that. Masa, what did he do? Helulo shalosh me'od garvei shemen v'yashav b'aliyah v'darshu. He took 300 measures of oil and he sat in an attic and v'darsho, and he explicated it. Okay, what does that mean? It means this guy said, I am going to solve all the theological difficulties the Yechezkel presents us with, not theological, like difficulties of contradictions with the Torah. And he took it to the attic with a ton of oil. He didn't come down until, oh guys, you didn't see my screen? Sorry about that. Do you want me to share my screen again and read it over? Someone answer. Yes? Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. Try it again. Okay, guys, do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So I'm going to read it again. Okay, so this is from the Talmud Chagiga 13. It's the Babylonian Talmud Chagiga 13a. And it says, Rabbi Yehuda said, I remember this man for good, and Hananiah ben Chizkiah is his name. Imalehu nignas sefer Yechezkel. Without him, the book of Yechezkel would have been put in hiding, essentially separated out and not included in our Tanakh, in our Bible. Shayud v'Rav Sotrin divrei Torah, that the words of Yechezkel contradicted the words of the Torah, right? Again, regarding certain sacrifices and things regarding the priests, etc. Ma'asa, what did he do? What did Hananiah ben Chizkiah do? Helulo shlosh me'ot gavei shemen. They brought up for him 300 measures of oil. V'yashav b'aliyah v'dorsho, and he sat in the attic and he interpreted it. He essentially solved the problems. So what was the idea? The idea was, he's like, Yechezkel has these issues. I'm going to go up to my attic with tons of oil. I'm not coming down again until I solve the problems. And he solved the problems, and Yechezkel could be in the Bible. Now, the thing is, what I always point out is, Why did he do that in this story? You can agree, disagree with the story, agree with the story. Why does he do it? Because Yechezkel's got to be in. Everyone knows that Yechezkel's a prophet that's got to be in there, right? You can't leave Yechezkel out. So he's got to solve the problems, right? No one does that with Ben Sira, right? Because Ben Sira isn't supposed to make it in. Ben Sira's too late to make it in, right? So what does it say about Ben Sira? I'm going to share my screen again. So Ben Sira, there we are. Here. It's talking about who's going to, if I remember correctly, it's talking about who's not going to have a portion in the world to come. So Rabbi Akiva says, even someone who reads external books. And Tana, it says, interprets Sefrei Minim. Tana like interprets it in the books of heretics. There's what are external books? Books of heretics. Okay, learn books of heretics. Rabbi Yosef says, B'Sefer Ben Sira Nami Asur Lemikri. Right? And he says, you're also not allowed to read the book of Ben Sira. Amarle Abaye my Tama. So Abaye says, what's the reason? And by the way, they can all quote Ben Sira by heart. We did this once together years ago in this class, where all of them are saying, well, you should read Ben Sira because otherwise we wouldn't get this message. And they're like, oh, but it's also in this verse. And they'll say, well, Ben Sira says this. They're all quoting Ben Sira by heart like crazy. Right? And they're really quoting him. We can find the quotes in Ben Sira, right? They all know Ben Sira by heart, right? But no, you can't read him. Why? Because Ben Sira is written too late. Ben Sira, they know exactly when Ben Sira is from. They know, but his grandson was the one who translated into Greek. Ben Sira lived during the Ptolemaic period in Israel. And he's he does not make it into the Return to Zion. There is no longer any Ruach HaKodesh, any Holy Spirit inspiring writing, and therefore Ben Sira doesn't get into the Judean Bible. But certainly during the Second Temple period, people consider Ben Sira really important, and even afterwards, they are quoting him like crazy. They're reading him. They're learning him by heart. Okay, if you ever read Ben Sira, you can see why he has a real feel of being between the Bible and the Mishnah. The language, the ideas, it's very, very comfortable. As I frequently say, I wouldn't want to be married to him and I wouldn't want to be his daughter. But most of the ideas feel very kind of comfortable coming from the Bible and the Mishnah. Reminding everyone to please mute yourself. Moving right along. Oh, I see a hand. Yes.
I understand it. The church fathers accepted the text from Canon or whatever, the text written by the Jews. Unlike the Muslims say the Jews corrupted it, but the early, like the church
Ezra corrupted it. Ezra corrupted it. Yeah.
Yes, but the church fathers accepted the text from the Jews and they translate into Latin, the Vulgate, but they added in the Catholic Bibles, the Apocrypha is, I believe, still part of their canon. Yes. Not for Protestants, but for Catholics,
right.
And
because of the Reformation,
right? But so they accepted this idea that there was they seem to imply that there was a Jewish canon, no? Or
I'm not saying, I don't think the Christians felt that there was no Jewish canon ever. What I meant was, for a Christian, the definition of canon is much stricter because of the way Christianity works. Yeah. Because Christianity at a certain point became very centralized and became an official state religion fairly early on in its history. Maybe not early enough for them, but fairly early on in its history. And then what canon became was literally a list of books. These are the allowed books. Whereas in Judaism, that happens A, relatively late, and B, at least in my opinion, it doesn't really happen. It's not really the way it happens. Right? In other words, I feel like things got kind of the gushbaka, they got the seal of approval after everyone knew they had to be in, right? And there were some books that the people weren't sure about. They weren't sure about Esther, they weren't sure about Shir, the Song of Songs, but in general, people already knew, and they knew because of a much more I want to say a much more organic process, a much more kind of natural growing and understanding of what is holy. Even though at a certain point there's a cutoff, there's a much stricter cutoff in the Judean Bible, in what I call the Judean Bible, right? In the Masoretic Bible, there's a much stricter cutoff than, let's say, in Alexandria, but it's not like what the way it seems to me like a lot of Christian scholars define canon is there is a list. And no, in the Second Temple, we did not have a list, right? So that's the difference. It's not saying, oh, you guys never had a canon, or even you guys didn't think these books were holy. It's how do we define the word canon, right? And once you in that, and it gets, sometimes you realize that what you're having is essentially a semantic argument. Okay, I see a comment. The prohibition against reading external books may refer to reading it publicly in the Beit Knesset. Yes, right. So the question is, if they say you can't read Ben Sira, how can they say that when they've all read Ben Sira, right? So the one of the proposed answers is what they mean when they say you can't read Ben Sira is you can't read it in shul, in the Beit Knesset, right? In the synagogue. You can't read it in the synagogue as if it were part of Tanakh, as if it were part of the biblical canon. You're not allowed to read Ben Sira as a portion of the prophets, or even as a portion of, like, during special days we read portions of the Ketuvim, of the writings, right? We read the Megillot. And so you're not allowed to do that. And what's very interesting is that if anyone knows what's the other name for Ben Sira in the Christian canon, Ecclesiasticus, because you read him in church. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting. So, but yeah, so it's very possibly that's a way of reconciling that very kind of weird thing where they're saying you can't read him, and then they're being like, oh, let's all quote him and argue about him. So like it's a very that solves that kind of dichotomy. Thanks, Moshe. Okay, and so and then there's a question. So we were talking about, so there's the question of what books got in, right? And so in the Second Temple period, there's still books floating around that some people are including and some people are not. What happens in Christianity is they need, I'm going to really simplify it. Like I know, like what I mean is, I know that what I'm presenting is kind of a generalized, simplified version, right? I'm sure that academic, their academics will be like, no, it's more complicated than that. But let's just say what happens is you have the early Christianity, right? Or even the Jesus movement, right? They need to spread the good word. They want to spread the good word. How are they going to do that? Well, they're going to go around the Mediterranean, right? And they're going to spread, and they're going to tell the story, right? The problem is that the Gospels and the story of Jesus they don't work unless the whole point, the Gospels are written, at least some of them, are written to show that Jesus is the culmination of biblical prophecy. So they don't work unless you have biblical prophecy. So they need to kind of take it together with the Bible and kind of sell it together. It's a package deal, right? The problem is they need it in Greek because no one's reading Hebrew. Well, no problem. It's actually not a problem at all. You've got the whole thing's in Greek, right? So they take the Septuagint, they put in the Gospels, and they take it on tour, right? They take it, around the Mediterranean. Now everyone can read it and hear it and understand it. And so they just take the whole thing. Now, because you've got, and then as Christianity grows, all of these books get Christian interpretations. So Judith represents the church, right, in the Christian tradition, right? So they all get these kind of Christian interpretations that in a way naturally kind of accrue, and that's the way they become understood. It's harder, for example, for me to understand how the Ethiopic church took jubilees. They took jubilees and became part of their canon, right? So you have these interesting books, the ways that different Jewish books survive, right? But the Catholic Church takes the entire Septuagint with all the Apocrypha. And then with the Reformation, they're like, oh, guys, you've been pulling one over on us because you have all these extra books that aren't in the Hebrew Bible, right? They're not the real thing. They're apocryphal, right? So they take those books out, right? They take those books out. right? And now they're called either the Apocrypha, or they're called intertestamental books because they're between the Old Testament and the New Testament, as it were. That's where they put them in the Christian Bibles. So that's the story with that. I'm going to move on to the last part of our class in a moment. I see a question. How do they distinguish between Kohelet and Ben Sira? Kohelet is Ecclesiastes, and Ben Sira is Ecclesiasticus. Okay, so there you go. Kohelet, Ecclesiastes is actually kind of a translation of Kohelet, right? To gather, right? Kohelet, in Ecclesiastes, to be a gathering, right? A gathering, or rather. And so, but Ecclesiastes and Ecclesiasticus, look, these are the same guys who bring you fourth Ezra and fifth Ezra, like sixth Ezra, like, no one's worried about people getting confused, right? That's your problem. It's not their problem. But anyway, so, and the final thing is, another thing is, what does it mean for something to be canonized? And this is a different argument. At what point do people say we can't change this book? And that's a much harder question, okay? Because we know there are. I'm gonna use the categorization that they used to use in a pretty standard way. There was Proto-Septuagint, Proto-Samaritan, and Proto-Masoretic texts in the Hebrew Bible. So you had let's say three different versions. I'm gonna correct this in just a second, okay? So you had three different versions, and then you had Qumran texts. You had Qumran. They had these different versions of Qumran that they didn't belong to a category. They were outside these categories. So there was a text that is, let's say, you could say an earlier version, quote unquote, of the Masoretic text. Earlier version, they may have different spelling. You may have teeny little differences, but it is essentially what we're used to in our Hebrew Bible. So, for example, the Isaiah scroll is very close to the Masoretic version, but it's spelled Malay. It's spelled with extra letters to show you the vowels. Okay. So the spelling's different, but the actual text is very, very close to the Masoretic text. Or then you have Proto-Septuagint. That is the Hebrew version of that the Greek was based on. The Septuagint that we have, there are places where it differs. There are verses that it has that are different from the Masoretic text. There are places where it seems less accurate. Maybe there are places where we're missing something. And you have the Hebrew text that lay underneath that translation, right? A classic example of this, of a solution that we have in the Septuagint, if you remember with Cain and Hevel, it says, and Cain said to Hevel, and it was when they were in the field, and Cain killed Hevel. Okay, I'm sure you can get me the exact quote, but it was Cain said to Hevel, and it was when they were in the field, and Cain killed Hevel. So what did he say? What did he say? So it's a great place for Midrash to tell us what he said, right? But in the text, something's missing. Something's very clearly missing. In the Septuagint, what does it say? And Cain said to Hevel, let's go to the field. Now, this clearly wasn't the original text. He had to fix it. They fixed it. They're like, here we have two problems. One, how'd they get to the field? B, what did he say? We're missing a piece. No problem. He said, let's go to the field. Fixed. So the question is, at what point did they stop fixing the text? At what point did people say, you're not allowed to do that? You got to leave it alone, right? Okay, so now we have a similar thing in the Proto-Samaritan text. Now, famously, if you know about the Samaritan text of the Bible, you have Har Gerizim put in various places, right? The importance of Har Gerizim, which is where they worship as opposed to in Jerusalem. Okay, so Har Gerizim is put in all sorts of places. However, those aren't the only differences. Okay, they took a certain version of the Bible and then they added the Har Gerizim stuff. Okay, that version of the Bible is called the Proto-Samaritan version, and that also fixes things. Okay, it has stuff that it fixes. Okay, so for example, Yaakov says to Rachel and Leah when he's explaining how he was so lucky to get all those spotted kids, right? Spotted kids, goat kids, not little kids. Spotted goat kids, right? He got all the spotted goat kids, and we know that he did it by making these branches and making the holes, and they were in heat, and then they had, okay. But he tells them that he had a dream, okay? But he didn't have the dream. We know we didn't see a dream. There was no dream. No problem. In the Proto-Samaritan text, he has a dream. He has the dream. So he didn't lie to Rachel and Leah, and we're not missing the dream. He's got the dream. Fixed. The problem's fixed. Great, right? In other words, now they want to fix an issue, okay? They want to fix a problem. The intentions are good. You understand why they want to do it, right? At what point, in the Masoretic text, they don't fix anything. Nothing's fixed, right? You see the whole thing, right? Now, so in those stories, right? So at what point do people say, no, you can't fix that? Yeah, it's a problem, but you can't touch it, right? At what point does that happen? Now, it clearly happens earlier with some texts than with others. But what is the story there? That's harder to see. You can look at something like this, and maybe it gives us an indication, maybe it doesn't. Let's take a look at Pesher Chavakuk, and with this I'm going to end. It shows us a few things. So Pesher Chavakuk, I'll explain first what it is. Pesher Chavakuk is a scroll. It's of course a Qumran and Dead Sea Scrolls. The Pesher was a very interesting form of interpretation where they would take a verse and say, and this is, and interpret it as applying to them and their history. Okay, and it's not clear if they thought that this was actually the purpose of the prophecy, and that no one understood it until then, or if they thought this was a second meaning of the prophecy. Okay, but they would interpret the prophecy as if it was talking about them. They did this also with Tehillim, with Psalms. So we have with Pesher Chavakuk, Pesher Nachum. So they took books of Chavakuk and Nachum are both in Treasar, the minor prophets. So we're going to take a quick look at Pesher Chavakuk. To illustrate two things. Let me show you. Okay, can everyone see my screen? I'm going to move to, here we are. Okay, this is accessible for all. Here we have the Pesher Chavakuk, a very nice photo, courtesy of the Israel Museum. And I wanted to point out a couple things. Here you can see, for example, there are corrections. Okay. Oh, well, let me actually put on. Oops, sorry about that. Hold on just a moment. Put on my little spotlight. Here we go. Okay. All right. So here you can see that there are corrections. Now, corrections are sometimes corrections of the text itself. In other words, of the explanation, and sometimes they are corrections of the biblical verse where a letter was dropped out, or let's move it on. Like here, there are places where here you see a yud was missing, and so there are places where the actual spelling of a verse is being corrected. Okay, so it isn't clear always whether what's being corrected is even in a verse. Is it being corrected because it's super important to get it right? Or is it being corrected just because, he's correcting everything? So, why not correct the spelling? Note here the use of the tetragrammaton, Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei. Note that it's using Paleo-Hebrew, as frequently Dead Sea Scrolls do. Not always, by the way, but very, very frequently. So on the one hand, you have different corrections that are sometimes done by the same scribe and sometimes by a different scribe who went over the scroll. Okay, so that would indicate that you can't change things. On the other hand, let's look at a specific example. Okay, and this here I have it for your convenience written out. This is the quote, and here's the quote, and here is the actual biblical verse. So let's read the actual biblical verse. Hoy mashkere, who woe unto him who gives his neighbor or friend to drink. Misapech chamatcha v'af shaker. He puts in venom and also even makes him drunk. Leman habit al ma'orehem, in order to look at their nakedness. Right? He gets his friend drunk to look at his nakedness. What a horrible thing. Okay. What is everyone? Please mute yourself. Um, and what do we have here? What is the quote here? Have mashke re'ehu misaper chamato af shaker, right? He or hoy mashke re'ehu misaper chamato af shaker. Woe is to the person who gives his fellow to drink, and he adds venom, or here has pouring out his anger. He adds venom, or he pours out his anger, whichever. It's the same. It's translations of the same words. It even makes him drunk. In order to look at the other verse was Ma'orehem, their nakedness, El Moadehem, their holy days, their holidays, really, their gathering days. They say holy days, not really like their holidays, their gathering days, right? What is this? It's changed the verse. Okay, Psharo, its explanation is about how HaKohen HaRasha, the wicked priest, and again you can follow in the English below. Asher radaf achar moreh hatzedek lival'o b'kas chamato abeit galuto. The wicked priest ran after the righteous teacher to swallow him up with the anger of his venom, or the anger of his anger, right, to the home of his exile, the place of his exile. ובקץ מועד מנוחת יום הכיפורים הופע עליהם לבלעם ולהכשילם ביום צום שבת מנוחתם. And at the time of the gathering of the rest of Yom Kippur, he appeared to them to swallow them up and to make them fail on the day of the fast of their Shabbos of rest, the Shabbat of rest. What's going on? What's going on here? Okay. As a reminder, at Qumran, they kept a different calendar. They kept a different calendar at Qumran. They kept the solar calendar. They didn't keep the typical Jewish lunar solar calendar. There is a question about at what point did they keep it? Were they able to actually keep a calendar which was not the correct, it was 364 days long, right? So you can't keep that for 100 years. The group exists for like 100 years. You can't keep a 364-day calendar for 100 years without noticing that something's going wrong, right? It doesn't work. So the question is, what did they do? I think they probably just adjusted it. They're just like, oh, whoops, someone made a mistake, and then they adjusted it. That's I think what they did. I think they could have kept it for 100 years in that way. And but they had a solar calendar, and so of course their Yom Kippur was not on the standard Yom Kippur. And apparently what happened is the wicked priest, who could have been the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, it could have been someone else who was known to them, okay? He actually went to where they were, probably Qumran, maybe somewhere else. It could be talking about some other major place that they were staying. He went to them at the time of their Yom Kippur, and he wanted to make them eat and drink, right? So what is the verse? The verse is he's trying to make his friend drink, right? He's going to make you add his anger, the anger of the Kohen, of this wicked priest, and also possibly he's adding the anger possibly of God. He's going to trick him up so he gets more anger, right? Leman, in order to look at El Moadehem, to their festivals, right? He went to look at their Yom Kippur, and he was going to make them drink. But that's not the verse, right? The verse is to look at Al Me'orehem, to look at their nakedness. So what exactly is going on? So there are a few possibilities, and these possibilities have an effect on what you think is happening in terms of the way they're seeing the biblical text. Can they change it? Can they not change it? So one possibility is they changed it. In order to have this really great interpretation, they quoted it wrong. The guy who wrote Pesach Habakkuk, whoever he was generally very, very careful with quotations, like in certain ways. Like he was very careful to, when he was quoting, he would use God's name, and certainly with God's name, he was very, very careful. It seems an unlikely, it's possible. It doesn't seem that likely. It doesn't seem that likely that he would have actually misquoted, especially since one assumes people would know it by heart. People knew it by heart, right? So one assumes that people would know the verse by heart. So it's also possible that they had a different version, or it's possible that they read it wrong. Ma'orehem and Mo'adehem look very, very similar. It's a very easy thing to make. The Resh and the Dalet look almost identical, if not identical sometimes. And that switch, Ma'or, Mo'ed, is just switching the Vav. It's very easy to do. So it's very possible that they read it wrong, and it's very possible they got copied wrong, and that they had a copy that said that. Right? So that affects how. So maybe they were being very careful with the quote, but they were quoting from a text that had either been deliberately changed or had been corrupted in that way. And so we see that there's this kind of, and at the same time, in that same scroll, they're correcting spelling, they're correcting texts. It's important for them to get things right, but also not just on the quotes, on everything. And so we see this kind of balance where at the same time that you have these different versions that can be quite different, we already in the Second Temple period are getting to the point where people are being pretty careful. And it seems like at that point, people are already like, you know what, you can't mess with this. You can write a new book, like the person who writes Jubilees, writes a whole new book, changing the whole story, and he solves problems, right? Right? It's not God who almost kills Moshe in the Chatan Damim story. It's Mastema who almost kills Moshe in the Chatan Damim story. Right? No problem. It's fixed, but he did it without changing the original biblical text. Okay? So they're already getting to the point where they're like, no, you can't touch that. If you want to fix it, we have a great genre for you, and it will be called Rewritten Bible, right? So when we talk about Rewritten Bible in the Second Temple period, we're talking about these books that rewrite the stories with the fixes inside them, but not pretending to be the original book. Right? And that becomes the way to kind of fix this. So already in the Second Temple period, not only do you have, to my mind at least, canonization in terms of you have certain books which are obviously part of a canon, and some other books that are kind of floating around. At the same time, you have this desire to not change things. You're already seeing a move to not fix things in the text themselves, but rather write other books that fix the problems. And by the way, this is another interesting point. On the one hand, I do want to say that Emmanuel Tov now has changed the way he categorizes things. He now thinks that the Proto-Septuagint text and the Proto-Samaritan text are part of the same family of texts. So it's them versus the Masoretic text. At the same time, a lot of these rewritten Bible texts actually use those more changed biblical texts as their base. They start from those texts that we call more harmonistic, that they've already tried to change, and then they do a rewritten Bible kind of around them. It's interesting that those are the texts that they usually kind of start with, and then they do write a whole book to fix it. And I do want to say also the fact that they write books to fix it, and the fact that it's important to fix these issues shows how important the books are to the people who are reading them and who are rewriting these books. It's important for it to work. It's important for the morality to work out. You can see from some of these books like Jubilees, what problems bothered them. It bothered them that God tells Bnei Yisrael to borrow stuff from the Egyptians without returning it. That bothers them. So in Jubilees, it's the angels. The angels do it, and then they're worried that Mastema is going to accuse Bnei Yisrael, is going to accuse the Israelites of taking this stuff before God. So they tie Mastema up, right? So in other words, there are different issues that become problems for people who are reading these books in the Second Temple period, reading or hearing them, and there's a desire to fix them because these books are so central. And we can think of the Pesharim, it's the same way. They're interpreting these verses, it's talking about themselves. It's a lot like if you go into a synagogue around election time and they start quoting the parsha and they're like, and that's like what happened last week, and that's like what everyone's deciding when they're going to the voting booth tomorrow, and all of a sudden, right, the verses are talking about us now, right? We just don't write it down that way. So the centrality, we see it as early as we have the written books, like as early as we actually have the scraps of the written books, we have this attitude towards the books of Tanakh, the Torah especially, and certainly the books of the other books of the Bible, that these are important books that say something and that have to be able to speak morally to us. So thank you. I'm going to take some questions. I hear from Susan. Do I think the rewrites to fix the problems are well done, or do they also sometimes create problems on their own, of their own? Something like David Halivni, who says that the stam in the Gemara often obscures rather than elucidating. Well, not to address the issue of the stam. Okay, I'm not addressing that now, but I will say that absolutely, books of the Second Temple period will all absolutely create problems, because if you have, for example, a book saying, well, in the Chatan Damim story, it says that God did it, but really it was Mastema. It's like, who are you kidding? That's first of all, like I know what the first that I read, like it's clear what you're trying to fix, right? So how does that solve anything? And sometimes they do create problems, like they that is part of the that's part of how this satanic model becomes so powerful, because you need a bad guy who can take on a lot of stuff. So you see this kind of growing in these well, particularly in Jubilees. Jubilees has Mastema, and then the Dead Sea Scrolls has Blial, right, which they use, and then you have someone to blame all the bad stuff on. Whereas before, and you could say, does that create a problem? Does it solve a problem? I think from a certain point of view, that absolutely creates a problem. So absolutely, sometimes they create problems, and sometimes you're just like, okay, who are you kidding? Yes. So anyway, so thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this class. I hope you find it at least somewhat relevant to Shavuot.
Oh, yeah.
And I will see you not next week, but the following week.
That's amazing.